Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change. And got a little sunset through the window behind me. Thought that's a nice special color. I don't know, y'all. I'm getting a very distinct sense of dread, and I think you all know what I am talking about. But it seems to be, as I read yesterday about the crop losses in Europe, Russia, Scandinavia, forcing food prices higher. Although in that article they talked about having lots of stores from last year. I can only help to wonder what the near future holds, depending on what crops are looking like from the rest of the world this year, depending on how much stores we have for the coming year. What does this all mean? What does this all mean? Also, as I was driving around Los Angeles today, the dead trees, not just the half dead trees, but the almost all the way dead trees, seem to be multiplying. I was just struck today by how prevalent and how many dead trees I saw today. It was everywhere. We had another day up into the mid 90s. Here it was 92 degrees in downtown LA, which is very warm for downtown LA. And it looks like this is just going to continue and continue and continue. Looking at hundreds in early next week. So I don't know. I'm as many of you are probably somewhat skeptical about Guy McPherson's September-October prognosis or prediction, if you will, or possibility. I'm skeptical of that too, but I don't know. Anything is possible, and I feel that is very true right now. That normalcy is a very fleeting thing in these days, and enjoy it while you can. I'm going to start off with more crop issues. This is from The Guardian today. North Korea warns of natural disaster as heatwave sears crops. Citizens urged to wage all-out battle to preserve food stocks amid unprecedented drought. The North Korean government has called on its people to wage an all-out battle against a record heat wave as the country's already fragile crops face drought and the authorities struggle to respond. The drought represented an unprecedented natural disaster, reported the Rodong Sinmun newspaper, the mouthpiece of the ruling Workers' Party. It urged citizens to join the struggle to save food production in a country that is no stranger to famine. Temperatures have reached more than 40 C, 104, in some regions since late July, and there have been sporadic reports of deaths from the heat. This high temperature phenomenon is the largest unprecedented natural disaster, but not an obstacle we cannot overcome, a commentary in Rodong Sinmun said. Extreme high temperatures and droughts have begun affecting farming crops, including rice and corn. We should muster all our power and capacity to fight high temperatures and droughts. North Korea's state-run media published several articles this week suggesting precautions in a country where air conditioning is almost non-existent. Government television said the heat was taking a toll on the economy, which is already subject to a tight international sanctions regime imposed over the country's nuclear program. The weather will certainly influence food production, and right now is a critical time, especially for rice crops, said Hiroyuki Konuma, a former Asia representative at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. All the farmers have to listen to government directives, and the decisions made now will be very important. If this weather and drought continues for another week or two, we should be very worried about North Korea's food production. The government has been working in recent years to boost production, but the system remains highly susceptible to weather extremes, he said. A cry for help. The North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, said in April that his government was shifting its focus from reducing nuclear weapons to improving the economy, but the country remains under UN sanctions that have brought most trade to a standstill. Food, medicine, and other humanitarian aid are exempt, and experts suggested state media attention on the problem may be a cry for help. North Korea experienced a devastating famine in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the aid it provided. Some researchers suggest as many as 1 million people died. The government newspaper told North Koreans to display their patriotic zeal and save every single droplet of water to combat the current drought. There is no tomorrow when it comes to fighting against high temperatures and droughts, said Rodong Sinmun comment said. The Rodong Sinmun comment said, according to a translation by South Korea's Yonhap news agency, if we just hope for luck and squander our time, it would cause irreversible consequences. In a separate article, the Pyongyang University of Medical Sciences told people to wear large hats and limit the time they spend working outdoors to avoid heat stroke. North Korea does not have enough electricity to power most homes throughout the day, meaning that families who do have fans may not be able to power them continuously. An unnamed source quoted by Daily NK, a Seoul-based news service, said North Koreans are expressing a great deal of concern because people are suffering from life-threatening heat and crops that are drying out. People have collapsed in the street due to the heat, the report said, and farmers are struggling to follow government orders to water fields by hand because of water shortages and extreme working conditions. The FAO warned last year of the worst drought in 16 years, saying a prolonged dry season threatened food security for a large part of its population. In South Korea, far wealthier than its northern neighbor, there have been at least 29 deaths caused by the heat, and more than 3 million head of the livestock have been killed. Good God. This is not good, people. This is not good. This is not good at all. Moving on, another article from The Guardian. Heatwave in Europe set to push up UK food prices. This is on the back of the article I read yesterday from Zoe Wood and Sarah Butler. This is from today. The ongoing heatwave is starting to burn a hole in Britain's pockets, as higher food prices linked to scorched harvests across Europe reach shops and restaurants. Today, I'm selling a box of broccoli for £8, but by Monday, that could have doubled, says Paul Murphy, a director of the Yes Chef, based at London's New Covent Garden Market, which supplies fruit and vegetables to restaurants in the capital. Broccoli is cooking in the fields. Farmers can't get them out of the ground quick enough before the sun yellows them, he said. We've not experienced anything like this in decades. The prices we expect to see over the next couple of weeks could be nothing compared to what's in store for autumn if the heat has done the damage growers think. The major supermarkets are partially insulated from sharp price moves by long-term supplier contracts. The price of broccoli on their shelves has already risen by more than a quarter year on year, according to the Grocery Trade Journal. While carrots are up 8.3% and onions 3.5%, and iceberg lettuce is now 52 pence on average compared with 49 pence this time last year. As some salad suppliers are being forced to ship in produce from the U.S. as soaring temperatures across Europe leave plants wilting in the fields. Anthony Gardner from G's, one of the UK's largest suppliers of salad leaves to supermarkets, said yields are down. Last weekend's rain, not significant. The whole of Northern Europe has seen higher than average temperatures, said Gardner. Belgian supermarkets are struggling to find lettuce. There are difficulties in Germany and Scandinavia. It varies week on week, but generally the salad industry is having to import from the US or other parts of Europe to meet demand. By comparison, Murphy reports bumper supplies of tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers, which are grown under glass. Take note. British wheat farmers are also fearful after the driest start to summer on record, with crops expected to fall to a 5-year low. The searing heat has also devastated wheat crops in Northern Europe. The German Farmers Association expects this year's winter wheat harvest to be the smallest since 2003. The crop, wilted by the highest May temperatures since 1881, is expected to shrink 25% this year to 18 million tons. Wheat production across the EU is expected to fall below 130 million tons for the first time in 6 years, according to cereal market analysts at Strategy Grains. The bloc is the world's largest wheat grower, with the grain a key ingredient in staples such as bread, biscuits, and breakfast cereals. The situation is catastrophic in Northern Europe, said Strategy Grains head analyst André Defoy. Wheat prices have surged more than 20% on European and U.S. markets in the past 3 weeks, as worries have mounted over global supplies. But analysts say high stocks in other grain crops could compensate for part of the shortfall. The price of beer could also rise in the coming months, as the malting barley crop, which is used to ferment the brew as well as provide flavor and color, has been a casualty. Expectations of a tightening supply has sent the wholesale price of European malting barley to a 5-year high of €236 per ton. Guys, not good. Guys, not good. So apparently there's some big climate change issue or climate change thing going on with the New York Times. But I'm going to read this particular article that looks to be hugely extensive. I don't know. I don't know how much I'm going to get of this article read today, but I'm going to try and do what I can. I'll dip into it and link this if you have not already read it yourself. And it's titled "Losing Earth: The Decade We Almost Stopped Climate Change" by Nathaniel Rich, August 1st, editor's note. This narrative by Nathaniel Rich is a work of history addressing the 10-year period from 1979 to 1989, the decisive decade when humankind first came to a broad understanding of the causes and dangers of climate change. Complementing the text is a series of aerial photographs and videos, all shot over the past year by George Steinmetz. With support from the Pulitzer Center, the 2-part article is based on 18 months of reporting and well over 100 interviews. It tracks the efforts of a small group of American scientists, activists, and politicians to raise the alarm and stave off catastrophe. It will come as a revelation to many readers, an agonizing revelation to understand how thoroughly they grasped the problem and how close they came to solving it. Jake Silverstein. Prologue. The world has warmed more than 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. The Paris Climate Agreement, the non-binding, unenforceable, and already unheeded treaty signed on Earth Day in 2016, hoped to restrict warming to 2 degrees. The odds of succeeding, according to a recent study based on current emissions trends, are 1 in 20. If by some miracle we are able to limit warming to 2 degrees, we will only have to negotiate the extinction of the world's tropical reefs, sea level rise of several meters, and the abandonment of the Persian Gulf. The climate scientist James Hansen has called 2-degree warming a prescription for long-term disaster. Long-term disaster is now the best-case scenario. 3-degree warming is a prescription for short-term disaster. Forests in the Arctic and the loss of most coastal cities. Robert Watson, a former director of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has argued that 3 degrees warming is the realistic minimum. 4 degrees. Europe in permanent drought. Vast areas of China, India, and Bangladesh claimed by desert. Polynesia swallowed by the sea. Colorado River thinned to a trickle. The American Southwest largely uninhabitable. The prospect of a 5-degree warming has prompted some of the world's leading climate scientists to warn of the end of human civilization. Is it a comfort or a curse, the knowledge that we could have avoided all of this? Because in the decade that ran from 1979 to 1989, we had an excellent opportunity to solve the climate crisis. The world's major powers came within several signatures of endorsing a binding global framework to reduce carbon emissions far closer than we've come since. During those years, the conditions for success could not have been made more favorable. The obstacles we blame for our current inaction had yet to emerge. Almost nothing stood in our way, nothing except ourselves. Nearly everything we understood about global warming was understood in 1979. By that year, data collected since 1957 confirmed what had been known since before the turn of the 20th century. Human beings have already altered our Earth's atmosphere through the indiscriminate burning of fossil fuels. The main scientific questions were settled beyond debate. And as the night beyond debate, right? I'm going to read that one more time. The main scientific questions were settled beyond debate. And as the 1980s began, attention turned from the diagnosis of the problem to refinement of the predicted consequences. Compared with string theory and genetic engineering, the greenhouse effect, a metaphor dating to the early 1900s, was ancient history described in any introduction to biology textbook. Nor was the basic science especially complicated. It could be reduced to a simple axiom. The more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the warmer the planet. And every year, by burning coal, oil, and gas, humankind belched increasingly obscene quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Why didn't we act? A common boogeyman to today is the fossil fuel industry, which in recent decades has committed to playing the role of the villain with comic book bravado. An entire subfield of climate literature has chronicled the machinations of industry lobbyists, the corruption of scientists, and the propaganda campaigns that even now continue to debase the political debate, long after the largest oil and gas companies have abandoned the dumb show of denialism. But the coordinated efforts to bewilder the public did not begin in earnest until the end of 1989. During the preceding decade, some of the largest oil companies, including Exxon and Shell, made good faith efforts to understand the scope of the crisis and grapple with possible solutions. Nor can the Republican Party be blamed. Today, only 42% of Republicans know that most scientists believe global warming is occurring and that percentage is falling. But during the 1980s, many prominent Republicans joined Democrats in judging the climate problem to be a rare political winner, nonpartisan and of the highest possible stakes. Among those who called for urgent, immediate, and far-reaching climate policy were Senators John Chafee, Robert Stafford, and David Durenberger, the EPA Administrator William K. Riley, and during his campaign for president, George H.W. Bush. As Malcolm Forbes Baldwin, the acting chairman of the President's Council for Environmental Quality, told industry executives in 1981, there can be no more important or conservative concern than the protection of the globe itself. The issue was unimpeachable, like support for veterans or small business. Except the climate had an even broader constituency composed of every human being on Earth. It was understood that action would have to come immediately. At the start of the 1980s, scientists within the federal government predicted that conclusive evidence of warming would appear on the global temperature record by the end of the decade, at which point it would be too late to avoid disaster. More than 30% of the human population lacked access to electricity. billions of people would not need to attain the American way of life in order to drastically increase global carbon emissions. A light bulb in every village would do it. A report prepared at the request of the White House by the National Academy of Sciences advised that the carbon dioxide issue should appear on the international agenda in a context that will maximize cooperation and consensus building and minimize political manipulation, controversy, and division. If the world had adopted the proposal, widely endorsed at the end of the 80s, a freezing of carbon emissions with a reduction of 20% by 2005, warming could have been held to less than 1.5 degrees. A broad international consensus had settled on a solution, a global treaty to curb carbon emissions. The idea began to coalesce as early as February 1979 at the first World Climate Conference in Geneva, when scientists from 50 nations agreed unanimously that it was urgently necessary to act. 4 months later, at the Group of Seven meeting in Tokyo, the leaders of the world's 7 wealthiest nations signed a statement resolving to reduce carbon emissions. 10 years later, the first major diplomatic meeting to approve the framework for a binding treaty was called in Netherlands. Delegates from more than 60 nations attended, with the goal of establishing a global summit meeting to be held about a year later. Among scientists and world leaders, the sentiment was unanimous. Action had to be taken, and the United States would need to lead. It didn't. The inaugural chapter of the climate change saga is over. In that chapter, call it apprehension. We identified the threat and its consequences. We spoke with increasing urgency and self-delusion of the prospect of triumphing against long odds. We did not seriously consider the prospect of failure. We understood what failure would mean for global temperatures, coastlines, agricultural yield, immigration patterns, the world economy. But we have not allowed ourselves to comprehend what failure might mean for us. How will it change the way we see ourselves? How we remember the past? How we imagine the future? Why did we do this to ourselves? These questions will be the subject of climate change's second chapter. Call it the reckoning. There can be no understanding of our current and future predicament without understanding why we failed to solve this problem when we had the chance. That we came so close as a civilization to breaking our suicide pact with fossil fuels can be credited to the efforts of a handful of people, among them a hyperkinetic lobbyist and a guileless atmospheric physicist who at great personal cost tried to warn humanity of what was coming. They risked their careers in a painful escalating campaign to solve the problem, first in scientific reports, later through conventional avenues of political persuasion, and finally with a strategy of public shaming. Their efforts were shrewd, passionate, robust, and they failed. What follows is their story and ours. Coming to grips with the fact that we are past the point. The first suggestion to Rafi Pomerantz that humankind was destroying the conditions necessary for its own survival came on page 66 of the government publication EPA 600 778-019. It was a technical report about coal, bound in a coal black cover with beige lettering. One of many such reports that lay in uneven piles around Pomerantz's windowless office on the first floor of the Capitol Hill townhouse that in the late 1970s served as the Washington headquarters of Friends of the Earth. In the final paragraph of the chapter on environmental regulation, the coal report's authors noted that the continued use of fossil fuels might, within 2 or 3 decades, bring about significant and damaging changes to the global atmosphere. Pomerantz paused, startled over the orphaned paragraph. It seemed to have come out of nowhere. He reread it. It made no sense to him. Pomerantz was not a scientist. He graduated from Cornell 11 years earlier with a degree in history. He had the tweedy appearance of an undernourished doctoral student emerging at dawn from the stacks. He wore horn-rimmed glasses and a thickish mustache that wilted disapprovingly over the corners of his mouth, though his defining characteristic was his gratuitous height, 6 feet 4 inches, which seemed to embarrass him. He stooped over to accommodate his interlocutors. He had an active face, prone to breaking out in wide, even maniacal grins, but in composure, as when he read the coal pamphlet, it projected concern. He struggled with technical reports. He proceeded as a historian might, cautiously scrutinizing the source material, reading between the lines. When that failed, he made phone calls, often to the authors of the reports, who tended to be surprised to hear from him. Scientists, he had found, were not in the habit of fielding questions from political lobbyists. They were not in the habit of thinking about politics. Pomerantz had one big question about the coal report. If the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas could invite global catastrophe, why had nobody told him about it? If anyone in Washington, if anyone in the United States should have been aware of such a danger, it was Pomerantz. As the deputy legislative director of Friends of the Earth, the wildly pugnacious nonprofit that David Brower helped found after resigning from the Sierra Club a decade earlier, Pomerantz was one of the nation's most connected environmental activists. That he was as easily accepted in the halls of the Dirksen Senate office building as at Earth Day rallies might have had something to do with the fact that he was a Morgenthau, the great-grandson of Henry Sr., Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. Great-nephew of Henry Jr., Franklin D. Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, second cousin to Robert, district attorney for Manhattan. Or perhaps it was just his charisma. Voluble, energetic, and obsessive, he seemed to be everywhere, speaking with everyone in a very loud voice at once. His chief obsession was air. After working as an organizer for welfare rights, he spent the second half of his 20s laboring to protect and expand the Clean Air Act, the comprehensive law regulating air pollution. That led him to the problem of acid rain and the coal report. He showed the unsettling paragraph to his office mate, Betsy Agel. Had she ever heard of the greenhouse effect? Was it really possible that human beings were overheating the planet? Agel shrugged. She hadn't heard about it either. That might have been the end of it, had Agel not greeted Pomerantz in the office a few mornings later holding a copy of a newspaper forwarded by Friends of the Earth's Denver office. Isn't this what you were talking about the other day, she asked. Agel pointed to an article about a prominent geophysicist named Gordon MacDonald, who was conducting a study on climate change with the Jasons, right? The mysterious coterie of elite scientists to which he belonged. Just an interesting aside, I recently just randomly ran into somebody whose grandfather worked for the Jasons, and apparently also the CIA. Very interesting conversation we had. And I wish it was actually longer because, I don't know, I wanted to pick her brain. They were like one of those teams of superheroes with complementary powers that joined forces in times of galactic crisis. They had been brought together by federal agencies, including the CIA, to devise scientific solutions to national security problems. How to detect an incoming missile, how to predict fallout from a nuclear bomb, how to develop unconventional weapons like plague-infested rats. The Jasons' activity had been a secret until the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which exposed their plan to festoon the Ho Chi Minh Trail with motion sensors that signaled to bombers. After the furor that followed, protesters set McDonald's garage on fire. The Jasons began to use their powers for peace instead of war. There was an urgent problem that demanded their attention. McDonald believed because human civilization faced an existential crisis. In How to Wreck an Environment, a 1968 essay published while he was a science advisor to Lyndon Johnson, McDonald predicted a near future in which nuclear weapons were effectively banned and the weapons of mass destruction were those of environmental catastrophe. One of the most potentially devastating such weapons, he believed, was that the gas that we exhaled with every breath, carbon dioxide. By vastly increasing carbon emissions, the world's most advanced militaries could alter weather patterns and wreak famine, drought, and economic collapse. In the decades since then, McDonald had been alarmed to see humankind begin in earnest to weaponize weather, not out of malice, but unwittingly. Let me say that again, unwittingly. During the spring of 1977 and the summer of 1978, the Jasons met to determine what would happen once the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doubled from pre-industrial revolution levels. It was an arbitrary milestone, the doubling, but a useful one. As its inevitability was not in question, the threshold would most likely be breached by 2035. The Jasons' report to the Department of Energy, The Long-Term Impact of Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide on Climate, was written in an understated tone that only enhanced its nightmarish findings. Global temperatures would increase by an average of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. Dust bowl conditions would threaten large areas of North America, Asia, and Africa. Access to drinking water and agricultural production would fall, triggering mass migration on an unprecedented scale. This is from 1978. Perhaps the most ominous feature, however, was the effect of a changing climate on the poles. Even a minimal warming could lead to rapid melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. The ice sheet contains enough water to raise the levels of the ocean 16 feet. The Jasons sent the report to dozens of scientists in the United States and abroad, to industry groups like the National Coal Association and the Electric Power Research Institute, and within the government to the National Academy of Sciences, Commerce Department, the EPA, NASA, the Pentagon, the NSA, every branch of the military, the National Security Council, and the White House. Pomerantz read about the atmospheric crisis in a state of shock that swelled briskly into outrage. This, he told Betsy Egel, is the whole banana. Indeed. Aptly put, the whole banana. Gordon MacDonald worked at the federally funded MITRE Corporation. They're also involved in something else. I can't remember what it is. I want to say perhaps the MITRE Corporation was somehow has some link to 9/11, if I remember correctly. His title was a senior research analyst, which was another way of saying senior science advisor to the national intelligence community. After a single phone call, Pomerantz, a former Vietnam War protester and conscientious objector, drove several miles on the Beltway to a group of anonymous white office buildings that more closely resembled the headquarters of a regional bank firm than the solar plexus of the American military-industrial complex. He was shown into the office of a brawny, soft-spoken man in blocky horn-rimmed frames who extended a hand like a bear's paw. I was going to say polar bear's paw. My eyes added that in there just for extra. I'm glad you're interested in this, MacDonald said, sizing up the young activist. How could I not be, Pomerantz said. How could anyone not be? MacDonald explained that he first studied the carbon dioxide issue when he was about Pomerantz's age in 1961, when he served as an advisor to John F. Kennedy. So going all the way back to the 60s, this goes way, way back. I think what I'm going to do, guys, is this is such a great story. I may actually read a little more, and I'm going to stop, and I'm going to maybe read the rest tomorrow. Pomerantz pieced together that MacDonald, in his youth, had been something of a prodigy. In his 20s, he advised Dwight D. Eisenhower on space exploration. At 32, he became a member of the National Academy of Sciences. At 40, he was appointed to the inaugural Council on Environmental Quality, where he advised Richard Nixon on environmental dangers of burning coal. He monitored the carbon dioxide problem the whole time with increasing alarm. MacDonald spoke for 2 hours. Pomerantz was appalled. If I set up briefings with some people on the Hill, he asked MacDonald, will you tell them what you just told me? Thus began the Gordon Rafe Carbon Dioxide Roadshow. Or is it Rafi? I don't know. Gordon and Rafe. Beginning in the spring of 1979, Pomerantz arranged informal meetings with the EPA, the National Security Council, the New York Times, the Council on Environmental Quality, and the Energy Department, which Pomerantz learned had established an office of carbon dioxide effects. Wow. 2 years earlier, at MacDonald's urging. Yeah. They had an office of carbon dioxide effects. Wonder if that's anywhere near around anymore. Probably not. The men settled into a routine, with MacDonald explaining the science and Pomerantz adding the exclamation points. They were surprised to learn how few senior officials were familiar with the Jason's findings, let alone understood the ramifications of global warming. At last, having worked their way up the federal hierarchy, the two went to see the president's top scientists Frank Press. Press's office was in the old executive office building, the granite fortress that stands on the White House grounds, just paces away from the West Wing. Out of respect for McDonald, Press had summoned to their meeting what seemed to be the entire senior staff of the President's Office of Science and Technology Policy. The officials consulted on every critical matter of energy and national security. What Pomerantz had expected to be yet another casual briefing assumed the character of a high-level national security meeting. He decided to let McDonald do all the talking. There was no need to emphasize to Press and his lieutenants that this was an issue of profound national significance. The hushed mood in the office told him that this was already understood. To explain what the carbon dioxide problem meant for the future, McDonald would begin his presentation by going back more than a century to John Tyndall, an Irish physicist who was an early champion of Charles Darwin's work and died after being accidentally poisoned by his wife. In 1859, Tyndall found that carbon dioxide absorbed heat and that variations in the composition of the atmosphere could create changes in climate. These findings inspired Svante Arrhenius, Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist and future Nobel laureate, to deduce in 1896 that the combustion of coal and petroleum could raise global temperatures. This warming would be noticeable in a few centuries, Arrhenius calculated, or sooner if consumption of fossil fuels continued to increase. Oh, and increase they did. Consumption increased beyond anything the Swedish chemist could have imagined. 4 decades later, a British steam engineer named Guy Stewart Callender discovered that at the weather stations he observed, the previous 5 years were the hottest in recorded history. Humankind, he wrote in a paper, had become able to speed up the processes of nature. That was in 1939. Okay, King Miura, talking about the 1930s were so much hotter than they were now, which they weren't. But here you go. We have evidence of global warming in the 1930s. After somebody took temperatures over many years. So put that in your pipe and smoke it up. McDonald's voice was calm but authoritative. His powerful, heavy hands conveying the force of his argument. He was a geophysicist trapped in the body of an offensive lineman, not offensive, but offensive. He had turned down a football scholarship to Rice in order to attend Harvard and seemed miscast as a preacher of atmospheric physics and existential doom. His audience listened in bowed silence. Pomerantz couldn't read them. Political bureaucrats were skilled at hiding their opinions. Pomerantz wasn't. He shifted restlessly in his chair, glancing between McDonald and the government suits, trying to see whether they grasped the shape of the behemoth that McDonald was describing. McDonald's history concluded with Roger Revelle, perhaps the most distinguished of the priestly cast of government scientists who, since the Manhattan Project, advised every president on major policy. He had been a close colleague of McDonald and Press since they served together under Kennedy. In a 1957 paper written with Hans Suess, Revelle concluded that human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment of the kind that could not have happened in the past nor be reproduced in the future. Revelle helped the Weather Bureau establish a continuous measurement of atmospheric carbon dioxide at a site perched near the summit of Mauna Loa on the Big Island of Hawaii, 11,500 feet above the sea, a rare, pristine natural laboratory on a planet blanketed by fossil fuel emissions. A young geochemist named Charles David Keeling charted the data. Keeling's graph came to be known as the Keeling curve, though it more closely resembled a jagged lightning bolt hurled toward the firmament. McDonald had a habit of tracing the Keeling curve in the air, his thick forefinger jabbing toward the ceiling. After nearly a decade of observation, Revelle had shared his concerns with Lyndon Johnson, who included them in a special message to Congress 2 weeks after his inauguration. Johnson explained that his generation had altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through the burning of fossil fuels, and his administration commissioned a study of the subject by his Science Advisory Committee. Revell was its chairman, and its 1965 executive report on carbon dioxide warned of the rapid melting of Antarctica, rising seas, increased acidity of fresh waters, changes that would require no less than a coordinated global effort to forestall. All right. Man, this is good. I'm going to come back and read the rest of this, but I just want to read this one more paragraph. In 1974, the CIA issued a classified report on the carbon dioxide problem. It concluded that climate change had begun around 1960 and had already caused major economic problems throughout the world. The future economic political impacts would be almost beyond comprehension. Yet emissions continued to rise, and at this rate, McDonald warned, they could see a snowless New England, the swamping of major coastal cities, as much as 40% decline in national wheat production. The forced migration of about 1/4 of the world's population, not within centuries, within their own lifetimes. Wow. Wow. Amazing stuff. Okay, so it's about as long as I can go tonight. Why didn't we do this? Why didn't we change this up? Why didn't we stop this? The only thing I can think of is dollar bills, right? Like, it had to be the acknowledgement that, you know, if we actually did something about this, it would be no good for the economy and probably no good for the military industrial complex. You know, the acknowledgement that you know, trying to actually tackle this would mean very bad things for the life that everybody was accustomed to. Maybe that's just my guess. But who knows? Maybe they'll have an answer for us in the rest of this article. I'll hope to be back tomorrow to read the rest of this. I will try, certainly. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Thank you so much always for your comments and your interactions below. Always, just great stuff. I appreciate you guys immensely. And yeah, that's about it. Thought I had something else to say, but I did not. Until tomorrow, peace.